Welcome to our second session in the Evidence Demands Verdict Bible study. Today we're going to look at the question of truth. What is truth? Why is truth important? How do we know truth? Now, Dad, when you first compiled Evidence Demands Verdict in the 1970s, early 70s, there wasn't even a chapter on truth. What change took place?
Well, one of the main reasons then, I thank God you joined with me in revising Evidence Demands a Verdict, is that so many of the issues and questions of 25, 30 years ago have totally changed today. And one is the issue of truth. You see, 25, 30 years ago, few people really questioned truth. It was objective, you could discover it, you could study it. But now, because of what has happened culturally, the concept of truth has totally changed. For example, it started out that truth was objective, you observed it. Then truth became subjective, it's what you thought. And then truth became, where it is today, emotional, it's what you feel. And if we do not deal with truth today, then I don't care what you write about history, about truth, it'll be non-effective. We've got to define truth.
So it's not only important to talk about what is true, but to make sure that people, although we use the same word truth, actually have an accurate understanding of truth. So what is truth? Give us a definition.
Dictionaries, most of them define truth this way: that which has fidelity to the original. What in the world does it mean, that which has fidelity to the original? Fidelity means the same as or equal to. The original, it'd be best with an illustration. Let's say I have a container of water, and I make a statement to Sean, I have a liter of water. And my son dares to question my opinion. He says, no, you don't. I said, I do too. He said, no, you. Now, is Sean's statement true and mine false, or is my statement true and his false? So we would go to the suburbs of Paris, where there's the International Bureau of Weights and Measures. And we would take the original design of a liter, and we would take my container of water and compare it. If my container had fidelity to the original, then my statement was true and Sean's was false. But knowing my son, he would have drank a little bit of it without me seeing it. So in this sense, his statement was true and mine was false. Why? My statement did not have fidelity or the same as equal to the original. And Sean, you have a great way of defining that in a very practical way.
Philosophers will define truth as what's called the correspondence theory of truth. Essentially, it's if you have a belief or an idea and it corresponds to reality, your belief is true. So if I say it's raining outside right now, walk outside and it's raining, that belief matches up with reality, it's true. If you go outside and it's not raining, that belief is false. So truth is essentially what corresponds with reality. Now, because feelings seem to dominate today, and we live in what's been called a post-truth society, some people say that truth doesn't even matter. It's not important. I've actually been asked this by students before. What would you say if somebody asked you, why is truth even important?
First of all, what was your answer that you learned from somebody else?
Well, I was speaking on a topic of relativism tied to truth, and a student came up to me right afterwards and said, Dr. McDowell, you just spent an hour talking about truth. Why is truth even important? I looked at him and I said, do you want the true answer or the false answer? And there was a pause, and then he kind of smirked because he realized if you ask the question, is truth important? What are you already assuming is important? It's truth. And I think the reality is because we're made in the image of God, there's so many bad ideas in our culture clouding and confusing truth, but we've been made to live in reality. We've been given minds and we want to understand the world as it exists. So I don't think this value of truth will ever fully disappear. I think it's really there.
Well, and to just show you how prevalent it is, not long ago I finished speaking at the National Apologetics Conference in Charlotte. And I had to get to the airport, so I walked down front where the people were, and I went to the right to go out the door. And I got about halfway there, and this university student way in the back is running down the aisle, and he yells out where everybody hears him, Dr. McDowell, why does truth even matter? Well, I remember what Sean had said. So he came right up to me, and I said it loud enough so everyone could hear it. I said, well, do you want the truthful answer or do you want the false answer? And I turned around and walked out. I got to the door and looked back. Here's this university student. He didn't get it. But whenever you ask a question, everyone wants a truthful answer, not a false answer. It's like every time an adolescent or a millennial, a Gen Z, turns on their smartphone and GPS, do they want a false way to get to their destination, or do they want a truthful way? We always want the truthful way. And that's why it is so important.
I don't even think we realize how much we base our lives on decisions that we think are true. Do I have school today? What time is school? What class? What's the directions to get there? Moment by moment, we're basing our life on what we think is true. But people push back and say, okay, maybe there's truth in the little things in daily life, or maybe there's truth in math or in science. But oftentimes what people say when it comes to morality or religion, there's no truth. And if there's no truth in religion, then there's no point of giving evidence for it being true. So how do we know there's truth in religion and in particular Christianity?
Well, first of all, the claim that God is a truthful claim. It's either true or false. The question, see, Christianity is an historical faith. It's based upon events claimed that happen within history, which are either true or false. And so, was Jesus Christ the Messiah, the Son of God? If that is true, then what he says about God, etc., is true, and it's the moral basis for life. If who he is not true, then you don't have a moral basis for life. And this is why I struggled so hard in the process of initially writing Evidence That Demands a Verdict to show that there was no objective history, that you could not make the claim Christ is the Son of God. But you know, it backfired on me.
And you were convinced by the evidence, which we're going to get to. One of the questions we look at is related to Christianity being a historical faith. So it took place in a certain time, at a certain place, and we can actually examine the record and see if that's true. So everything, in a sense, rests on the identity of Jesus invading history in a certain place at a certain time. Does the historical record point towards that? Now, oftentimes what we hear and studies show increasing amounts of people will say, well, all religions lead to God. Christianity may be true for you, but Buddhism or some other faith is true for me. And a big question is, why can't all religions be true? And I think if we take a step back and look at not some of the secondary beliefs about, say, the nature of baptism or some specifics about, say, church structure, and look at the heart of different religions, you realize that fundamentally they contradict. So, for example, in many versions of Buddhism, there is no personal God. It's actually atheistic. In Hinduism, there's 330 million gods. In Islam, there's one God, Allah, who's a unity. In Christianity, there's one God, three persons, a trinity. Now, all of those could be false.
That's true.
But they can't possibly all be true. So we know all religions aren't true because they contradict on the character of God, nature of salvation, and the afterlife.
It made sense to me as a non-believer to see, is there morality? Does God exist in everything? To start with the person of Jesus Christ who lived in objective history, time-space history, as we know it today. Why? Because for the most part, he was the only religious leader who claimed to be God himself. So why wouldn't you start with Christ? Why start with somebody that doesn't claim to be God? You start with somebody who claimed to be God and try to refute it or prove it based on the evidence. And that's what brought me to Christ and ended up what brought Evidence That Demands a Verdict into existence.
One of the objections that seems to come up somewhat frequently is there is no truth. There's no such thing as truth. And clearly, if there is no truth, then Jesus can't be God, can't be the truth like you described. Now, I'm guessing some of you are reflecting on this right now because there's a big problem inherent with the claim there is no truth. So if somebody says to you there's no truth, ask them a simple question. Is that True. Now, if the person says yes, then just parrot back and say, okay, so it's true that there's no truth. If the person says no, then simply say, then why did you say it and why expect me to believe it? We all know there's such a thing as truth. Now, people might not come right out and say there's no such thing as truth, but you might hear people say things like this: you shouldn't force your morality on other people. And this is the same kind of self-refuting claim as saying there is no truth. Why? If someone says you shouldn't force your morality on somebody else, what are they doing? They're actually trying to convince you that your morality is wrong and their morality is right. So I've had people say to me, you shouldn't force your morality on others. And I ask a simple question: is that your morality? They've said yes. And I say, if you're not supposed to force your morals on other people and that's your morality, then why are you trying to force it on me? And we see the same kind of confusion when people say things like, you shouldn't exclude views different than your own. You should be more open-minded. Again, contradiction. Or you shouldn't judge other moral values. These are all contradictions, and look for those because they make the same mistake as the claim: there is no truth. Now, another one sometimes we'll hear is, well, sincerity is more important than truth. Are you really going to tell somebody who sincerely has a different belief system that they're wrong?
I would say absolutely. Because, and I think it's an obvious statement, you can be sincerely wrong. In my own life, over the years, I could probably pick out 2 or 3 areas that I was very sincere in speaking as truth, and somebody came along and said, do you know, that might not be true. Look at this and this and this. And I would say there are 2 or 3 times that every time I felt bad about it, but what I'd been teaching was not truth, but I was totally sincere. And the key is, especially as a Christian, we should never be afraid of being shown that something we believe is not true. Because if anyone is committed to truth, it should be a Christian. We are told to know the truth. Christ claimed to be the truth. And so this is why in over 250 debates I've done, I always kind of went into a debate kind of excited with a certain enthusiasm, because if there's anything I was debating that wasn't true, then I wanted to know it. So I had no fear of somebody else showing that something that I teach is wrong. But I'll tell you this, they better have good evidence.
You can be sincerely wrong. You can also be insincerely right. Sincerity and truth are different categories. And that makes a similar mistake as in conversations I've had people say to me, oh, you think you know truth. That's arrogant and that's hateful. And this commits what's called the ad hominem fallacy. In other words, now the person is attacking you, technically attacking the man instead of the issue. So when I've had people say this to me, oh gosh, that's arrogant, you think you have truth, I just say, okay, time out. Here we're having a conversation back and forth, debating an issue. Now you turn and attack me. What does my arrogance or lack thereof or humility have anything to do with whether my position is true or false? And the reality is, you can be arrogant and right, you can be arrogant and wrong. You can be humble and right, you can be humble and wrong. But I do think there is a connection between being humble and the willingness to recognize truth. Now, a big one today, let me ask you this, is that feelings trump truth.
About a year ago, I called Sean, because I'm basically a researcher. And I said, son, as far as I recall, in the last year or two, it's the first time historically that issues to do with family and marriage and morality is its feelings trumping science. It's feelings trumping fact. That it's not a scientific issue anymore. It's not a factual issue anymore. It's an issue of how I feel about it.
That's why it's so important that we actually look at the evidence, in particular on issues related to religion and God, which are the biggest questions we can ask. And we're going to start doing that in the next session when we look at the New Testament. We have to ask the question, what's the quality of evidence? What's the quantity of evidence? And do we have reason to believe that the New Testament is reliable and true? Looking forward to unpacking that with you.